Therapist, and I'm also a therapist for Panurgic L.I.F.E Foundation, which is a nonprofit dedicated to helping military veterans and first responders through expedition work, wilderness therapy, for either short or long-term expeditions. And today I'm going to talk to you from a therapeutic standpoint about 7 different myths or misconceptions that we unknowingly kind of portray upon our veterans. So when I first started working with veterans back in the day, the comments I would get would fall under pretty much, good for you, tough population, a lot of PTSD, right? Myth number 1 is that all combat veterans have PTSD, and that's simply not the case. The criteria, the DSM criteria for PTSD is pretty stringent. You have to do there's the psychological, the physiological, the behavioral, all of which need to be met. And so how a veteran processes traumatic event does not instantly categorize them with a mental health diagnosis of PTSD. In an upcoming video, we'll go over PTSD versus moral injury, which often goes undiagnosed and sometimes gets lumped into the diagnosis of PTSD, but can be very different. Misconception number 2. If a veteran does have PTSD, they are unpredictable, unstable, violent. This is not always categorically true. The common misconception can create barriers for veterans that need support. They don't want to seek treatment for fear of getting a diagnosis that may impact how they're perceived by others, as well as the ability to own or use a firearm for enjoyment. It's important to note that for anyone who suffers from PTSD, it is more likely to cause problems for the sufferer than it is for the people around them. Misconception number 3, all veterans are gun nuts. This conjures up unflattering imagery of a veteran gun owner. I have shared in other videos that I was not raised around guns. Guns were a foreign and misunderstood concept to me. However, upon starting my work with veterans, I began to see common themes regarding guns, peer connection, mental health. Shooting as a sport or hobby in and of itself is very present moment experience. You combine body control, breath control, fine and gross motor skills, and you have a goal, right? So there's therapeutic value in the art of shooting well. All veterans are not gun nuts. However, a large proportion celebrate their right to bear arms and participate in the sport of shooting. Misconception number 4, veterans are killers. What is the number 1 question most veterans will get asked by a civilian? Did you kill anybody? It is a fascination that most civilians have, this notion of military and violence. And in my experience as a therapist, it is a question that minimizes the act of service our veterans have done for us. It's an uncomfortable question, and I can speak candidly about the clients that I work with, veterans that I work with. They don't like it. The fact that we as civilians have the freedom without consequence to even ask questions like that, right? The amount of inappropriate questions that we do ask speaks to the service that they have done as far as protecting our constitutional rights and freedoms that we have. So it's a mind shift. They're not killers, they are defenders. Misconception number 5, getting hired as a veteran is easy. I will never forget an experience I had on a hiring committee while I was working as a therapist in the schools. This was an open teaching position that was available, and after a round of interviews, we chose and we hired a candidate for the position. A few days later, myself, someone else, not the entire hiring team, we were called in with my administration and told, private meeting, that we were to hold a kind of a fake interview process for a candidate, a veteran candidate who had been overlooked because service was not, there was no classroom time, right? And the service was deemed something that made this particular candidate not viable. However, I think unbeknownst to the administration at the time, you had to do an interview for anyone who does fall under veteran status. And so we conducted an interview knowing that there was no job for this man, and he came in full suit with a briefcase and looked legitimately excited by this opportunity. Interview was spot on, skills were spot on. He would have been a tremendous asset to that classroom of kids, and he would have brought a lot of leadership to that position. Being a veteran does not mean you are going to be a shoo-in for anything. This leads us to misconception number 6. There's a common belief out there that most veterans are less skilled than their counterparts, whether that be thinking for themselves without a chain of command or civilian workforce experience. I personally am continually amazed at the breadth of experience and skills that veterans have, that my clients have. Their ability to problem solve, find creative solutions, work under tight deadlines, and navigate complex situations are top notch. I work with a Panurgic participant who was an Army convo driver, arguably the best at what he does because it's life or death, comes back into the civilian fold and wasn't able to use his time in service, trucking knowledge, driving time, significant training to land a trucking job without extra training. Similarly, I had a pilot who wasn't able to transfer the years of experience into commercial flights that he had, right? He had to go to training. So, I mean, these are some of the best trained people out there, cross-trained in a variety of areas, put to the test on multiple occasions, and because of their service, they are considered untrained and inexperienced. Misconception number 7, veterans are loners, antisocial. From my experience as a therapist, veterans tend to keep a tight circle when it comes to whom they choose to spend their time with or their hobbies with. While this may create a certain mystique around the combat veteran, I would like to bring some awareness to the fact that many veterans have social anxiety, and that may be upsetting to some to hear. Maybe some don't agree with that, but when the work I do, I see it constantly. The lack of comfort when it comes to crowds asking for support. If they're struggling with the transition from military to civilian world, they won't always have a great response for, what do you currently do, right? As a matter of fact, that can be an embarrassing question or intimidating question, right? Because for most of them, in their minds, they were at the pinnacle of badassery, if you will, and now they're trying to compete for, floor jobs where you might be well established, right? There's things they can't talk about in their service. What did you do? And so oftentimes those conversations become really uncomfortable. I remember hearing when I first started this work that veterans fall into one of 3 categories. They're either victims of war, villains of war, or vindicators of war. Box thinking, right? That ignores the humanness of veterans as complex individuals with unique circumstances. And in the U.S., there are 1.4 million people in the military, with an additional 22 million more veterans. That is a massive population of dedicated people who have made a commitment to our country. And we at Panurgic L.I.F.E, myself, we thank you for that commitment. I guess the takeaway from this would please, help support our veterans by disarming misconceptions about who they are and what they bring to the table.